Okay, so today's topic is called the universal mind, and it's another one of my favorite lectures. They're all my favorite. Okay, so then we will talk about another aspect of the mind, or rather we'll continue to talk about the mind, right? Last week we talked about the three minds, and we were mainly focused on our individual mind, okay? But as the great philosopher Hermes Trismegistus said once, as above, so below. Every aspect of the universe is the universe itself. Okay, so every one of us are like a universe in miniature. Okay, and later on we'll talk about the different cosmoses and how things are kind of arranged in the entire universe. But in essence, everything is a representation of the same essence. Okay, so just in the same way that we have our own mind, the universe also has a mind. Okay, in Indian and Brahmanism, they call it the mind of Brahma, which is the universe. Okay, so they say that this universe is a thought in the mind of Brahma. Brahma being the creator. Okay, and just the same way that God has a mind, all of us also have a mind, right? And the minds of everyone are interconnected also. Okay, so this universal mind, this universal consciousness also connects us all. Okay, so nothing is separate from anything. The mind, the substance of the mind, and the substance of the consciousness is what unites us all. Okay, so Master Samael explains to us in the first quote in the lecture. It says the mind is a universal. The mind is a universal energy. The mind vibrates with all of creation. The entire universe is within the human mind. Okay, so then just in the same way that we are within the universe, we also have the universe within ourselves. Okay, and this is why Hermes Trismegistus said, "As above, so below." Okay, so like I said, the entire universe is within the human mind, and all of the minds are within all of the minds. Okay, so we're all connected with the mind. So every one of our individual minds are connected to this universal mind. Okay, and there's a lot of interesting scientific research now with relation to this. Even now, scientists that are claiming or saying that the universe is like a giant brain. Okay, and at the end of the class, we'll watch a couple of videos. But in essence, what they've been looking at just pictures of the brain and the neural connections of the brain of the humans, and compare that to how the universe looks from afar, right? From what they call a cluster of galaxies. And when you put the pictures side by side, they actually look the same. They also look like neural connections. So then the scientists are saying that if the universe looks like a giant brain, then everything that is happening within that brain is happening within the mind of God, right? And then who are we in relation to that, and who is the thinker, right? So everything is like in scales and scales and scales, which is why I love the end of the movie Men in Black, the last scene when he closes the locker, and then it focuses out of the earth, yeah. And then out of the entire universe, and then our universe is in like a little pebble, and then there are other pebbles, and then this aliens take those pebbles and put it in the bag. it's like to put it into perspective. That's kind of like what the universe is, you know. And now scientists are also saying how they know now that the universe has different dimensions, right? Up to 11 or 13 dimensions. So we have parallel universes. So on top of a physical universe, we also have parallel universes in other dimensions of forms, which are different vibrations of the energy, right? So matter that is vibrating at a different speed, and our eyes cannot perceive it, but it's still here, right? Okay, so what is this universal mind? Okay, this universal mind is really the imagination of God himself, okay? Master Samael says here that the great reality does not know itself, okay? But upon contemplating itself in the living mirror of the great imagination of nature, then comes to know itself, okay? So God created the universe and able to know himself. Kind of like, and this is the same thing that we do when we sit down to meditate, okay? When you sit down to meditate, you close your eyes and you begin to look within, right? To get to know yourself, to see who is behind all of those thoughts, and why you're thinking that way and all of that, right? So the Kabbalist, this is a thought from the Kabbalist tradition. They say that God doesn't know himself, so the only way for him to know himself is to create like a mirror where he can contemplate himself and look at himself, right? Just like the same way that you look at yourself in the mirror to study yourself and to see yourself, God does the same thing, okay? So he begins to look into his mind, okay? So when he begins to look into his mind, there is that energy or that force that is directed towards the center. It's what's called the universal mind, okay? Once that energy or that current gets to the center of the universe, in our case, the center of the universe or matter has a reaction, okay? So sends forth another, that same force towards the periphery, okay? So look at the universe as a circle, right? So the energy that comes from the periphery, which is the imagination of God, goes all the way into the center of the universe. Once it gets to the center or the denser aspect of the universe, then that reacts and that force is expelled outwards, okay? So then the friction of those two forces create what we call the consciousness, okay? Or the cosmic consciousness. So in that process, God becomes conscious of himself, okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Should I draw it?
Yeah. You can do it I'm still in the circle.
Okay. No, because it's a very interesting concept. So the same way we're going to use the same concept to create a soul. Okay. So this is a universe. Okay. So the great reality, huh? Oh, sure. Okay. So this is the universe. Okay, and we're here. This is God, okay? The great reality. So then he creates the universe. So the universe is a thought in the mind of God, okay? So this is all fake. This is all illusory, which is another point. So then as he begins to send all of his conscious or actually mental energy towards the center to get to know that, right? Once we get there, then when he sees something, then that brings back information, right?
So he sees something within himself.
Right. So he becomes aware of something within himself, and now he brings that information back to himself, okay? So this friction of ideas is what will create eventually the cosmic soul, or a soul, okay? All right. So this is what we do within ourselves. Every time that you sit down to meditate, or every time, well, not even just to meditate, but just every time that you're present and you take information and you become conscious of that information, you use that energy to create your soul, okay? Most traditions tell us that we don't have a soul yet, and we have to create it. What we have is a fraction of the soul, which is called the essence or the embryo of the soul, okay? This we talked about in class 5, I think, the personality, the consciousness, the personality, and the ego, right? So we are a consciousness to start. We are a consciousness, or rather, we are an essence that is conscious of itself, or has a consciousness, right? So then, if by correctly using the energies and the impressions of life, we're going to be able to create a soul, okay? And then the soul is what's going to allow us to go back into the great reality, okay, or the source of where we came from, all right? So, okay, so that is the universal mind, and then what comes out of the universal mind, or from our own mind, is the ability to create the consciousness, the soul, Okay. Okay. So in this process, we begin to know ourselves. All right. And so the mind of God is imagination and will, because in this whole process there is imagination and will. Okay, just like whenever you want to do something, you have to focus your mental energy, and the two poles of, or the two polarities of the mind are imagination and will. Okay. So it's like they say, when there's a will, there's a way, right? The mind figures things out. Okay. So whenever there's a will, you use your imagination to create. Okay. So the mind is what gives shape to matter, to energy. Okay. Which are the same thing. Matter and energy are the same thing. Okay. This is also in relation to what Plato called the world of pure ideas. Okay. Plato said that there is a world that we can access where all of the ideas emanate from. And he called it the world of pure ideas. And everything that we see here is a representation of those ideas. Okay? So everything that we see here in the universe, in essence, it's not real because it's only a representation of
the world of
right. So then what's more real? The chair or the idea of the chair, right? So we want to try to connect to what's real, okay? That's why Master Samael uses the great reality.
Okay, so to connect to the world of ideas, we need to be present.
Yes, and you need to use
that's the only way.
And you need to use your internal mind, your interior mind. That's what we studied that last week, right?
Right.
So the essential mind is the one that's focused only with the external world, okay? And your mind is just going outward. So when we use our internal mind, we connect to the universal mind, which is the place where all of our minds come together, okay? And this is also an important aspect because all of us are interconnected. Not physically, but with our minds, we're all connected, okay?
So God, in this order of ideas, God is only seeing beauty within himself. Because he is in present stage.
Yeah, well, beauty is a concept that we created.
Okay.
So
he's only seeing perfection.
he's beyond duality. Yeah. So everything that he sees are just facts, right? Or things, right? We're the ones that label them ugly and beauty, etc. Okay. So then connecting with, so then we need to connect ourselves with this universal mind, which is the mind of God. Why? Because we have lost our connection with Him. And this is why we have created this dual nature within ourselves, right? This is why we begin to create a personality and we begin to create an ego, okay? So again, what is the ego? The ego is simply the consciousness acting against its own nature, okay? So then the consciousness is altruistic, the consciousness is pure, the consciousness is compassionate, right? But when the consciousness became under the influence of the ego, then it started acting against all of those principles, right? So then instead of compassionate, we became what? Self-interested or greedy, right? Instead of loving, we begin to hate, etc., right? So this is why in the Gnostic studies we try to inspire people to eliminate their ego, okay? To eliminate that darkness that we all have within so that the light that's within ourselves can shine and express itself fully, okay? Which is where all of these New Age culture falls short on, okay? And all of these New Age principles and even some religions, or at least religions in their external aspect, just want you to be good, right? So they just want you to focus on the good aspect of yourself, which is good because you're going to be a good person, and at least you're not going to generate any more disharmony and create suffering. But we need to go a step further, which is to not only hang on to those universal principles of the consciousness, but also eliminate all of those things that don't allow the consciousness to express itself, right? So that is what we call the ego. So all of those, that false way of looking at the world, the false way of acting, of thinking, etc. Right?
That's not part of the universal mind. The ego is out of that context.
Well, it's all part of it.
It's all fun.
It's all part of, because the ego is not. It's part of this universe. See?
Because the way I see is that once you're present, like once you're connected, your ego is not there.
The ego is not present in the human machine, but it's still in your psyche. See, you're just not letting it allow. You're not allowing it to express itself.
But not in the inner mind. There's three minds, right?
Right.
Intermediate,
The sensual, the intermediate, and then the interior mind.
the interior mind.
Okay,
There's
no.
ego in the
No, the ego is not in the mind. The ego is surrounding the consciousness. Okay, the ego or the conscious. Remember, the mind, the emotions, and the body are simply vehicles of expression. Okay, so then the consciousness or the ego are the ones that choose to express themselves or perceive the world through all of those vehicles. So the ego is not in the mind. Okay, but it is within the universe. Okay, so think of God as. Think of yourself as as God Himself too. So as we get to know ourselves, God is also knowing Himself. Okay, so we are like imperfect parts of God, and that's why He created this so that we can perfect ourselves. Okay, and He can perfect Himself as well. Just like as the individual changes, and the individual creates changes within himself, the mass and the country and society also changes. Okay, so this is the foundation of also social philosophy, right? And in Gnostic doctrine, we have this idea that if the individual changes, then the mass changes. Okay, it is no use if you elect presidents and governors that all went to the same school that you did and all think the same way. The system is not going to change, right? The system is only going to change when me individually or I individually begin to change, begin to act in favor of the consciousness and express virtues, and then that virtuousness is going to become contagious. Okay, in the same way that bad behaviors become contagious, right? Like in Spanish, we say "nada bueno se pega," right? Like we just learn, the first thing that we learn are vices. That's like the easiest thing, right? When you're learning a language, you learn the curse languages first. the words, right?
Yeah, but
That's the thing. So that's what we'll talk about mental epidemics. So all of our minds are connected, right? So we need to connect to the universal mind to connect with those universal archetypes or those universal ideas or pure ideas of what it is to be a consciousness, how to act as a consciousness and as a soul, right? And then when we begin to connect with those universal archetypes, we begin to see the contrast between what it is to be a consciousness and what it is to act as an ego. Okay. So then, of course, you want to eliminate all of that within you, right? Okay. So we connect to the universal mind by opening our interior mind. Okay. This is how we get revelation.
I got connected for 1 second.
Huh?
I got connected for 1 second.
Right. So then when we open our inner mind, we begin to have revelations, okay? Which is a religious term, I guess, that we're familiar with. But a revelation is simply comprehension, okay? When you comprehend something, you've been revealed something about your own psychology, about your own world, okay? These are also divine gifts. Now, something very interesting about these revelations and these connecting with these ideas, there's this guy, or he died. This was an Indian mathematician. Okay, his name was Ramanujan, Sri something Ramanujan. Okay, so this guy started having dreams. Right, he said that in his visions, the goddess Shiva gave him, which was his divine mother in the Indian tradition. Shiva is your divine mother. His divine mother came to him in dreams and started giving him mathematical formulas. Okay, so he started writing them down, and then all of a sudden he found out that those mathematical formulas were actual formulas that mathematicians all over the world were trying to solve. So he wrote this letter to, I think, Oxford University, and he sent them all of these mathematical formulas, or the solution to these formulas. And then when they saw him, they were like, okay, how did this guy figure this out? So then they went to India, and they found out he actually never went to school, or he had like basic elementary, he went to basic elementary school, basic math theory, whatever. So they couldn't explain how he was able to come up with all of the solutions to these problems. Okay, and he simply said, well, they were revealed to me. My mother gave them to me. Okay, so how do you explain that? All right. So that is just one example of how, again, what Plato said, the world of pure ideas. We can resolve all of the things if we just connect ourselves to that universal mind. Okay. Also, in here we can talk about the many different inventions that were invented technically at the same time by different peoples in different places. Okay. So here we can talk about how the pyramids were built in Mexico and Bosnia and Egypt. All of those pyramids were built by cultures that didn't have contact with each other. And they lived in different eras, etc. Right? I've heard anthropologists say that that's very easily explainable in the way that all cultures actually emanated from one particular point, and the Earth, which was what we know as Iraq, all of that sort, and then they all kind of spread around. And then he says, well, they all kind of carried those same archetypes, ideas, and they were developed, and et cetera, right? But that's only a theory that doesn't hold, because when we look at cultures, we'll see that before this culture actually flourished, there were other cultures before that, right? Like the Atlanteans, like the Lemurians, etc. So Plato also talked about Atlantis, right? There was this ancient civilization that was right in the middle of what we call the Atlantic Ocean right now, right? But all of that culture submerged in water. Okay, so that culture was the one that taught the culture that we already know. Okay, so anyway, the whole theory about that, it's kind of loose, right? It doesn't really connect to. It doesn't really explain in a satisfactory way how all of these cultures really came up with the same ideas at the same time. And if we go to more modern examples, we have, for example, I have some notes here. The theory of evolution, for instance, was thought about by Darwin and Wallace at the same time. Calculus was invented by Newton and Leibniz. Decimal fractions by 3 people. Sunspots by 4 people, etc.
Yeah,
the telescope was invented.
The greatest man in history connected to the universe.
Right, and the greatest inventors and the greatest minds in history always said that enable for you to, or they received their inventions when they were in a state of meditation. They basically had some things, and then they just kind of put their mind in a receptive state and open themselves to receive these information or these ideas. Kind of like when you're trying to figure out a problem, right? Remember we talked about how to solve problems in our 2 classes ago, right? So what we do is we have all these ideas in the head, but it's not until you kind of relax and just stop thinking about it that the idea comes in. Okay, so this is the same thing. Okay, the telephone, for example, was invented, or 2 people tried to patent the telephone at the same time, and one of them is the one that we know now, right? Alex Graham Bell. The other one you never heard about because too bad. He was like 2 hours late in the patent office.
What?
He was so Alexander Graham Bell was here in New York, and this guy was in Idaho somewhere or in Ohio.
Did they both know that?
No, they had no connection with each other. The same with the TV. There's this Russian guy that actually said that he came up with the idea first, etc. So yeah, there are all these interesting ideas or interesting things that happen that make you kind of think, all right, sure, these are just coincidences, right? But as the more that you begin to study these things, the more you'll see that there are no such thing as coincidences. So Alex Graham Bell and Elisha Gray, those were the two that invented the phone at the same time. Elisha arrived 2 hours later to the patent office than Alexander Graham Bell. Philo Farnsworth, 1921, the inventor of the TV. He was an Idaho potato farmer. He had a vision of the TV. So he said this idea of a TV just suddenly came to his mind, right? He wasn't just thinking about it. And this other guy, Vladimir K. Swarikin, it's Russian, sorry. He came up with the same idea at the same time, okay? Also, what's interesting about this is that, as we know, our minds limit our physical accomplishments, okay? And...
So excited.
Tiffany.
We cannot tell.
Okay, so...
What limits you is what makes you great. It's all about how you...
That depends on how you use it, exactly. And the beauty of this Hermetic teaching is that we all think ourselves as separate entities and we're all special, and, right? But the truth is that we actually all influence each other unconsciously, okay? And this, you can see this with the what's called the 100th monkey experiment, where basically what scientists found out was that they began to train monkeys how to resolve a problem, okay? And then what they realized that after 100 monkeys or so, it's kind of like every other monkey in the world was able to resolve the problem in less time, okay?
Wow.
So it's like I trained Tito here how to do something, and then a random kid in India begins to solve the problem in a shorter amount of time, okay? Very interesting. So then, this is because once we download information from this universal mind and it penetrates into our individual mind, it also becomes knowledge for all of the minds around, okay? So we can see here people that have broken records in history, okay? Roger Bannister, he was the first person to run a mile under 4 minutes, okay? And this was back in 1954. Before him, no one else was able to run a mile under 4 minutes. Right after he did it, a week later, someone broke the record. Just 1 week. And now we're down to like a few seconds to a mile, you know? Yeah. If well, not a few minutes, but like a couple of minutes. I think the fastest one. Yeah. I think the fastest one. The fastest one is like a minute 30 or something like that. But yeah, sorry, not seconds. Sorry. Maybe road run.
326 seconds.
Okay, so then the mind limits what we can physically do. When, for example, during the Revolutionary War in America, right, the British Army was the most powerful army in the world at that time. Nobody was able to defeat them. But as soon as the Americans said, yeah, we're going to defeat them, and they went out and they did it, then all of the other revolutions started happening. The French Revolution, Simon Bolivar and all of South America, etc., right? Good, so you can see how really this universal mind, once we connect with it, we can all begin to change, right? And this is the importance of what we teach and how we act, right? So the way that we are influences the world, right? This is why the Buddha said this, right? I was going to say this later, but let's just say it now. The Buddha said, we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Okay? So, even if you think that you're not creating any problems to society with the way that you think, with the way that you are, well, you actually are. Okay? And we'll also look at some scientific evidence to prove this. Something very interesting that's called the quantum entanglement, where nothing in the universe is separate. Okay, and they were able to see how different particles, once they separate particles, they still influence each other through this invisible thread that they don't know how to explain, or they have come up with the idea of the unified field, okay, which in religious terms or spiritual terms is the consciousness, okay, or God or the soul, okay. Okay, so then it is important for us to become aware of what we call mental epidemics, okay. Master Samael says that mental waves are propagated in all places, okay, so every single thought that you have in your mind is being sent out into the universe, into the environment, okay? So if you're thinking about something, I can come along and all of a sudden I get this random idea that I never thought about. And guess what? It's Tito's idea now getting into my head, okay? It's true, sorry. So our mind is a participant in the universe, okay? So this is why in the Buddhist tradition, the discipline of the mind is very important in practicing ethics, right? Acting in a righteous way is not only a good thing, but it's also our cosmic duty. See? And this is what all of the masters of wisdom have come here to tell us, right? That we need to change, that we need to awaken, and not only because it's good for yourself, but because it is your cosmic duty to change and make your environment better, right? And one of the most exalted masters was Jesus the Christ, because he actually did that physically, right? He gave even his own life, right, his own body to show us what we need to do, and psychologically, right, to give up everything, to give up all of our egotistical and selfish ways, and think about the cosmic scenario, okay? So we pass on from an individual perspective to a cosmic scenario, or a cosmic perspective, okay? So for this, we need to practice mental hygiene, okay? So that's why I said that we need to get in touch with those pure ideas of compassion, of altruism, right? Of love, etc. Because when you cling yourself to those, then you begin to project that onto the world as well, okay? So as we eliminate our darkness, we also expand or create more light within ourselves, which is going to generate more life towards others, right? So the way that we are certainly influences others, right? If you're grumpy, you're going to make other people grumpy, right? If you're always in a bad mood, that's what you're going to generate, right? And this also relates to that lecture in the beginning when we talked about the two lines of life. Remember, we talked about the different levels of being, right? So now put that into perspective, okay? We all have different levels of beings, and people certainly find themselves surrounded by the level of being that they enjoy to be at, right? That is why you find people of low level of beings, and I won't say which ones or what their characteristics is, whatever you think is a low level of being, they'll be always vibrating at that same level, right? So they will all tend to be together. And even if they want to change, they will always attract those same levels of being, because until they are able to raise their level of being, and then they'll begin to meet and attract other people that are in that same level of being, right? So I always see it in these classes, for instance, right? Where I begin to meet people that are trying to raise their level of being. They're trying to make sense of their life. They're trying to be good. They're trying to act ethical. And you're doing something about it, right? So, and I'm also doing the same thing. So we kind of all attract each other in that level of being, right? Or in that yearning. That's what's also called the law of attraction. If you look at many different, like, New Age documentaries and stuff. Okay. So practicing mental hygiene is very important, because if we want to begin to get rid of this darkness that we have within ourselves, then you have to also avoid being in touch with that, right? So it's like if you have a particular vice, if some people have the vice of alcoholism or drugs or substance abuse, right? They want to stay away from atmospheres that generate or trigger that desire within them, right? So they want to start hanging out with other people, so that in that way they're practicing mental hygiene, right? So if we want to eliminate the violence within ourselves, then we need to get in touch with the opposite of violence. So watching and looking at movies that are um, based or founded upon ethical principles, right? Like mythology, for instance, like art, like beautiful art, like music, right? Music that stimulates this this universal and ethical aspect of ourselves, right? And so their music, their type of music and art in general for every single level of being, right? So it's your choice now to try to choose wisely, to see what you are going to impregnate your mind with, right? Because what you're going to bring into your mind, it's what you're going to return to the universe itself. Okay, so.
No, because now we're gonna start early today.
Oh, okay.
6 o'clock. So
Okay, yeah. So this is what this class is about, and I might keep it short. Next class we'll talk about the awakening of the consciousness, because now we want to begin to develop the consciousness. So we will talk about the awakening of the consciousness, and like 2 or 3 classes that are in relation to the consciousness itself, empowering the consciousness, so that we can begin to perceive ourselves as the consciousness. And then we'll take a little break from the program, and we'll do a few lectures of meditation and like technicalities about foundations of meditation, and then we'll go back to the mysteries of the soul, and then we'll talk about the mysteries of life and death, what happens to the soul after it dies, all of these things. Are pretty interesting. All right, so I'll show you guys 1 or 2 documentaries, and another thing about mental hygiene, which is related to a documentary that I'm going to show, is with whole scientific research done on prayer and how prayer, if prayer is really effective or not, right? So they did a few studies to see how a bunch of meditators in a city, whether a bunch of meditators in a city in a particular day would be able to influence the environment. Okay, and the research shows that in different cities around the world, during the days that these meditators sat down and meditated on compassion and joy, the crime rate of the cities went down, the economy actually went up, and all of these interesting things in the social aspect started happening, right? Which is a direct corroboration that what we're talking about here is it's something factual. It's not just ideas and concepts that we're throwing out, right? So as we begin to practice this, you'll begin to see how your environment begins to change as well, okay? So then,
see you later.
okay, you guys
See you
leaving?
later.
Later.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you.
All right. So yeah, there's a lot of like skepticism about prayer, for instance, right? I mean, I wasn't a big fan of it, but then as I started looking at the science behind it, I started to experience it for myself. I started to realize that, okay, this is actually work, and it's not something bogus that they're just talking about. So now we know why when Buddhists are chanting the mantra Om Mani Padme Hum at all times, what they're doing is they're purifying their mind, and they're not allowing negative thoughts and ideas to enter their mind. So in this case, so they're actually not doing, they're doing that not just for themselves, but they're actually making our environment better, right? Because they're not polluting the environment. This is why also like in big cities, and there's a lot of, when people are gathered, we tend to fall more under stress because all of these minds emitting thoughts to each other, right? Which is very powerful. So, yeah, try to have nice thoughts when you come in here. Yeah, and that's also the reason why we have like specific types of art in this room. You know, I don't have art that's egoic art or subjective art, right? I try to create a good feng shui, you know. Okay, so any questions, ideas, comments? Very interesting, right?
Yeah. Think about like language, how language is so powerful.
Oh yeah.
Words. When you combine some certain words together, it's powerful. Like mantras, praying.
Yeah. That's why we should also use appropriate language. The language that we use is in relation to levels of being, you know. So we'll also talk about that when we talk about impressions and yeah. Anyway, so.